All right, Yevamos, say good morning. Let us begin a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan. Baruch Meir and Rina Dubin for dedicating all the Shurim and Drashos this month in the Schus for Refuah Shlema for their niece Chavat Tzipora Bas Chaim Malka. Shmuley and Libudinovitz for dedicating the Shurim and Drashos this month in the Schus of an Aliyah for the Neshama of Shmuley's father, Harav Peretz Avram Ben Rav Binyamin Moshe Zichrona Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors, Ira and Miriam Grossman, in honor of their 50th wedding anniversary, and Mazel Tov, and Adam and Leslie Rosen in the Schus of Refuah Shlema for Esther Bas Sarah. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of those who require a refuah should have one together, Kol Cholei Yisrael, all of the neshama should have an aliyah, and the families a nechama. But with that, let us begin. We have a really exceptional, beautiful, magnificent daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Kuf Dalid 104. We are picking up at the Mishnah on Kuf Dalid Amud Aleph. Says the Mishnah, Choltza Alayla. So let's remember again, we're now in the 12th parak of Maseches Yevamos, the parak of Mitzvahs Chalitza, and it is here that we are getting into the mechanics, the mechanistic details of Chalitza. So says the Mishnah, Choltza Balayla, Chalitza Sekshera. If you do Chalitza at night, the Chalitza is kosher. Rabbi Elazar Posel. Rabbi Elazar, however, says that the chalitza is going to be posel. Similarly, bismol, if you do chalitza with the left foot, chalitza psula. Ultimately, the chalitza is posel. Rabbi Elazar machshir. Rabbi Elazar says that it's kosher. So again, two machloksim between the Tanakama and Rabbi Elazar. First, in chalitza at night, Tanakama is saying it's kosher. Rabbi Elazar is saying it's posel. Chalitza on the left foot, Tanakama is saying posel. Rabbi Elazar is saying kosher. Says the Gemara, to analyze the machlokes. Leima b'ha kamiflagi. We'll say quite fascinating. So let's focus first on the machlokes concerning the timing of chalitza. So now again, we've got, in terms of chalitza b'layla, we have the Tanakama saying it is kosher, Rabbi Elazar saying that it's posel. What's at the core of this machlokes? So leima b'ha kamiflagi. Says the Gemara, let's say that we're arguing about the following point. Demar savar makshinon rivim linigoim. Umar Savar lo makshinon rivim linigoim. So we'll say interesting discussion, interesting idea. Do we compare rivim? Rivim literally means disputes, but what it really means in this particular context is judicial adjudication, right? Again, Maisa Bezdin. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, linigoim. It's 3 lines down from the top. Rashi says linigoim. Kol riv v'chol nega. Shabbos say the Torah, when discusses the halachos of Beis Din, says that what does Beis Din adjudicate? Every riv. Riv means a dispute. Nega means tsara'as. Tsara'as. So says the Gemara, manigoim ri'iyasam bayom. So it's interesting when the Torah speaks about Beis Din. So the Torah says Beis Din's role will be to determine rivim, disputes, and negoim, the halachos of tsara'as. Now we know when it comes to tsara'as, ma negoim riyasam bayom. So let's remember again, what's the halacha by tzaras? The kohen has to view the lesion, he has to view the tzaras. That can only be done by day. D'chsiv ubiyom heiraos bo. Af rivim bayom. So we'll say, here's what we know. Before we get into chalitza, here's what I know. The fact that the Torah juxtaposes rivim to negoim teaches me something very important, which is, just like negoim can only be determined by day, so to rivim, when Beis Din has a case, Beis Din could also only paskin on the case by day. Now, what does that have to do with chalitza? It says Rashi, v'chalitza dinhu. Here's what's interesting. Chalitza falls under the category of rivim. In other words, chalitza is considered to be a din Torah. Now, why is chalitza considered to be a din Torah? Because we'll say every chalitza has a monetary aspect associated with it as well, which is what? The ksuva. Rashi says, the gova ksuvasa. Because remember again, with the chalitza, a woman collects her ksuva. Now, I'll say a little chazara. When a woman does yibum, where does her ksuva come from? Where does ksuva come? Right, come from first husband. Right, unless of course what? He has no money. Right. Remember again, part of the din of chalitza, or part of the din. Well, I should say differently. The truth is, the din of yibum or chalitza, ksuva is paid out from the estate of the first husband. If there's no estate from the first husband, If there's chalitza, what does she get? Nothing, right? If there's yibum, ultimately, again, she'll go ahead and the second husband is obligated to provide her with the ksuva. But the idea over here is that what you see from this Gemara is that the estate essentially is settled after chalitza. So in other words, Ruvain is married to Rachel. Ruvain dies without children. So now what's going to happen? He has a surviving brother, Shimon. So now we're waiting to see, is Shimon going to do yibum? Is Shimon going to do chalitza? So interestingly enough, we wait to settle the estate of Ruvain until we know what is going to happen with Shimon. So therefore again, the process of chalitza falls under the umbrella of what we call rivim, falls under the umbrella of a judicial process. So Rabbi says, now here's the issue. So the Gemara says, Mar Savra Makshina Rivim Lenegoim. One says we make the comparison of Rivim to Negoim, just like what? Just like Negoim have to be seen by day, so too what? Judicial processes must take place when? By day. And Chalitza is a judicial process because it has a monetary component. Therefore, it must also be done by day. Umar Savar, Lo Makshin and Rivim Negoim. The other opinion says, no, we don't compare Rivim to Negoim. We don't compare it. And therefore, Allah Lamaisa, we don't say just because they're juxtaposed that Rivim have to take place by day. And therefore, because Rivim don't have to take place by day like Negoim, therefore, again, Chalitza doesn't have to take place by day as well. Okay, says the Gemara Lo. The Chuli Alma Lo Makshin and Rivim Negoim. The truth is, everyone agrees that we do not compare Rivim to Negoim. Di'i Makshinon. Because let's listen to this. Because if you were to compare Rivim to Negoim, Afilu Gimar din balayla nami lo. Rabbi say this is very interesting. See, if you were to compare Rivim to Negoim, then what would that tell you? That would tell you that Allah Lamaisa, the same way that the viewing of Negoim has to take place by day, so every aspect of an adjudication process has to take place by day as well. But we actually don't paskin that way. See, Rabbi say, we paskin that a Beis Din doesn't go into session except by day. But yet, interestingly enough, the way we do paskin is that if Beis Din went ahead and started, not a capital case, but a financial case, right, by day, they could do the Gemar Din, they could pass the verdict at night. At night. So obviously, we don't make that comparison between Rivim and Negoim. The Hacha Miflagi. So I will say, what's the machlokis over here in the Mishnah? Mar Savar Chalitza Kitzur. Say, so based on where the Gemara is holding right now, we do not learn, we do not compare Rivim to Negoim. In other words, they're two different things. Negoim, when do you have to judge Negoim? By day, right? By day, right? Rivim, judicial cases, I will say, what's the halacha? You have to begin them by day. But what? They can be finished at night. Okay, so now what's the machlokis by chalitza? So watch this. V'acha b'haka miflagi. Mar savar chalitza ketchilas din damya, umar savar chalitza kegmar din damya. So I will say this is very interesting. The shaila is, how do you look at chalitza? Is chalitza considered to be the beginning of a din Torah or the end of a din Torah? Rabbi say, what's the nafkamina if it's the beginning or the end? What's the nafkamina? If it's the beginning, then what? It can only be done by day. But if it's the end, right? The end, Gemar Din, then what? It can even be done at night. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Ketchilas din damya din nafkalam b'sanhedrin be'echad dinei mamanis tetchilas din bayom. So Rabbi say, it's an interesting way. How do you look at chalitza? Is chalitza the beginning of a process? Or is chalitza the end of a process? And I will say you could see that both ways. Interestingly enough, that will ultimately determine whether or not chalitza could be done at night. If you hold that chalitza is a gemar din, then the same way, the end of the judicial process, then the same way that Beis Din could start a din Torah by day and finish it by night, so too chalitza can be done at night as well. But if you look at chalitza as tchilas din, the beginning of the judicial process, then what? Then halacha l'maisa, you cannot do it at night. That's the machlokas. So the Gemara goes back to the Gemara says, Rabba barchia kitusfa avad uvda b'mok ubiyechidi ubalayla. Shabbos is very interesting. So Rabbi Barchia Kitusvat, that's his name. Old Kitusvat Bepashtos is a place. He went ahead and he conducted a chalitza. And I will say, how did he do this chalitza? Listen to this. This is actually quite fascinating. He did it b'mok. Mok is a felt shoe, right? Bi'echidi, he did it himself. In other words, apparently he did not use a beis din. And lastly, balayla, he did it at night. So Amar Shmuel heard about this and he said, Kama Rav Guvrei Da'avid Ki Yechida. And I will say, Shmuel said, how great must this man be that he conducted himself like an individual opinion. And I will say, if you look at Rashi says over here, Kama Rav Guvrei B'Lashon Ginai Amra. I will say, you know what the interesting thing about sarcasm is? The tone determines everything, right? So you could read this phrase and Shmuel said, oh, how great is this man that he conducted himself like a singular opinion. Or you could say, oh, how great is this guy that he conducted himself. So Shmuel said the latter, right? It was said with a bit of a sarcastic tone. Who is this guy? Rabbi Barchia Kitusva, that he's rejecting the majority opinion, conducting himself like a das yachid. By the way, both say on multiple levels. First of all, it's the felt shoe, right? It's the not using a beis din, and it's also going ahead and doing chalitza at night. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. My kasha, what was Shmuel's problem with Rabbi Barchia's behavior? Right? So Rabbi say again, so Rabbi Barchia does three things: felt shoe, no beis din, and chalitza at night. So what was Shmuel bothered by? Says Gemara, my kasha, imok, if he was bothered by the fact that Rabbi Barchia used a felt shoe, imok, stama tanya. The truth is, Rabbi say, we do have a stam brisa. Rashi says over here, we just saw this 2 days ago, bebraisa de la'el, bekav hakitia, bemok, besmichas haraglayim. So Rabbi say, we did see an opinion in a brisa, a stam brisa, that did say you could use the felt shoe. It was actually talking about by the prosthetic. But Lamaisa, we saw it. So it's not like he's going rogue over here. There is a stam brisa like that. Ilaila. And ultimately, again, if Shmuel was upset that he did chalitza at night, stama tanya, we have another brisa, ultimately, again, that says chalitza seksher. We'll say that's our Mishnah. Our Mishnah did say chaltza balayla chalitza sekshera. It's true, Rabbi Lazar disagrees, but the stam opinion of the Mishnah is that chalitza works at night. To which the Gemara says, rather, what Shmuel was most bothered by was not by the felt shoe, was not by the fact that Rabbi Barchia did it at night, but rather what? That he didn't use the beis din. That he conducted a chalitza by himself. To which the Gemara says, Heihi avid biyechidi. How could he have conducted a chalitza by himself? The Gemara says, Heihi avid biyechidi. The yechida katani la disnan cholza b'shnayim o b'shlosha. Both say if he did chalitza with either two people who are ksherim, or three people, but what happened? But one of the members of the beis din, one of the three, was found out to be a relative or to be invalid. Chalitza sapsula. The chalitza is pasul. Reb Shimon, Rabbi Yonasan HaSandler machshirim. Reb Shimon, Rabbi Yonasan HaSandler said, no, it's kosher. And one time it happened, we'll actually see this in the next Mishnah. One time it happened that a man and a woman did chalitza privately in a jail. Apparently they were incarcerated and they did chalitza between the two of them. Uba ma'aslif Rabbi Akiva v'hechshir. And this episode came before Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva declared it a valid chalitza. Rabbi Yosef Daf Yomi, Rabbi Nachman, ein halacha ka'oso zug. The halacha does not follow this parable. The halacha doesn't follow Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan Sandler, who say that you could do a chalitza without a beis din. So therefore again, what Shmuel was most bothered by, he wasn't so bothered by the felt shoe, even though it's not the majority opinion. He wasn't even so bothered by the chalitza done at night, because after all, you do have a Mishnah that supports that. What he was bothered by is how is Rabbi Barchia, how is he doing a chalitza without a beis din? Because even though you have Reb Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler who say you don't need a beis din, we say ein halacha ka'oso zug. The halacha does not follow that pair. The halacha doesn't follow that opinion. Sakar Rabbi Barchia, go ahead and do a chalitza without a beis din. So the Gemara says, the The truth is, maybe all of these things only reflect individual opinions. The Sanya, Am Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi, Ani Ra'is Yesh Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, Shechavatz b'mok, ubi yechidi, ubalayla. Ultimately, I will say it's possible that really Rabbi Bar Chia was basing himself on the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, because Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha is the Das Yachid who holds that you could use a felt shoe, you could do chalitza without a beis din, and you could do it at night. So I both say, so remember again, we paskin halacha l'maisa. So we paskin halacha l'maisa. Number one, you need a leather shoe. You need a leather shoe, right? Number two, halacha l'maisa. Chalitza absolutely requires a beis din. That was the first Mishnah in this parak. Now remember again, do you need a beis din of dayanim mumchim? Do you need expert judges? No. Even hadyotos, as long as those hadyotos are skilled enough to what? Remember again, what do they have to do? Feed the man and the woman their respective lines, right? Their respective psukim. That's all you need. They will say, how do we paskin here? So here the Rabban paskins that halacha l'maisa you can't do chalitza at night. Chalitza has to be done by day, and a chalitza done at night is going to be pasul. In Kabbalah, by the way, when we say the chalitza is pasul, what does that require? What does that require? You do it again. You have to do it again. So that's how you paskin. So both say, so therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, for our purposes in this sugya right now, chalitza has to be done by day. A chalitza done at night is psula. To which the Gemara goes weiter, chaltza b'smal chalitza. So both now the next machlokes in the Mishnah was what happens if halacha l'maisa you do chalitza with the left foot instead of the right foot. Do chalitza with the left foot. So we'll say, what's the halacha? I'll say here the Stam Mishnah Tanakama says pasul. Rabbi Lazar says it's kosher. Okay, so what's the machlokes? Very interesting. B'smol chalitzasa, my time with Rabbanon. Rabbi say, by the way, it's nice to see these sugyas in Yevamos, right? I know everyone misses the complicated family tree charts. I know. Don't worry, we're not totally finished those, but it's nice. It's nice, like to see like a regular Gemara. So listen to this. So remember, so what's the machlokes here? What's the machlokes here? My time with Rabbanon. So why did the Rabbanan say that if you do chalitza with the left foot, that's such a chalitza as psula? Amar ula yalfinan regel mimetzora. So we'll say, listen to this, to make a gzera shava of regel from mitzora. Regel from mitzora. So we'll say, what does this mean? Now, what's the pasuk over here by mitzora? So the pasuk is talking about, again, the blood applications for the purification of the mitzora. Remember again, the blood application for the purification of the mitzora goes where? On the big toe, on the big toe on the right foot of the mitzora. So it says regel by mitzora, it says regel by chalitza. So the Gemara says, what do you see from here? What do you see from here? Yafina regular mitzora, malahalon diyamin, afkan diyamin. Just like the foot by the mitzora, the blood application is done on the right foot. So to by chalitza, the blood application is done on the right foot. Good, says the Gemara. Rabbi Lazar, lo yalef regular mitzora. Rabbi Lazar doesn't accept this drasha. He just doesn't accept the Gemara. So remember again, a gzera shava is something one has a mitzora for. So either if you don't have a Masorah for it, then Lamaisa again you don't accept it. So Rabbi Lazar does not have a Masorah for this particular Gzera Shava. The Gemara is Aiva Tanya, and therefore I will say again, if you don't have the Gzera Shava, then what? Then Chalitza doesn't have to be limited to the right foot. Although it could be lechatchila, you should use the right foot. But b'di eved, if you don't, the chalitza is still kshera. To which the Gemara says, "Vatanya Rabbi Lazar Omer minayim l'ritzia shiba ozen hayimanis." So Rabbi Lazar says, how do you know that the piercing of the ear, right, by the eved, ultimately again is on the right ear? Ne'emar kan ozen, v'ne'emar lahalon ozen. It says over here by the eved ozen, right? V'higisho adonav ela elokim. We'll say, this is the Aved who does not want to go free at the end of 7 years. Jewish servant this is. So what do you do with him? You take his ear, right? You take him by the doorpost and you pierce his ear. Which ear do you use? So the Gemara, Rabbi Lazar says, it's based on a Gzera Shava to Tzaras, to the Matzora. Rabbi says over Ne'emar, Kan Ozen, The ne'emar lahalon ozen. It says ozen over here by the eved, you pierce his ear. And it says by the purification of the mitzorah that you apply blood to his ear. Oh, I'm sorry, now you apply blood. Right, by the mitzorah, you apply blood to his ear. Ma lahalon yamin, just like by the mitzorah, the blood application is done to his right ear. Afkan yamin, so too by the eved, you pierce his right ear. You pierce his right ear. So I will say, so here's what's interesting. We just follow the flow over here, right? We have machlokis in the Mishnah. Let's put this here. We have machlokis in the Mishnah. What's the machlokis in the Mishnah? Can you use if you did chalitza on the left shoe, on the left foot, does that work? So ultimately, again, the Tana Kama says pasul, Rebbe Lazar says kosher. So says the Gemara, what's the logic of the Rabbanan? The Rabbanan make a gzera shava regel from chalitza ultimately again to mitzorah. Just like mitzorah has to be the right foot, blood application on the right foot, so too chalitza has to be the blood application on the right foot. Rebbe Lazar doesn't have the gzera shava. Here's what's interesting. Rebbe Lazar, when it comes to Eved Ivri, says if your Eved doesn't want to go free at the end of 7 years, what do? You pierce his ear. Which ear? So Rebbe Lazar makes a gzera shava from Eved Ivri, ultimately to what? To mitzorah. Just like by the purification of the mitzvah, it has to be the right ear. So too, again, by the Eved Ivri, has to be the right ear. Which means that Rebbe Lazar is making gzera shavas to mitzvah. So why does he make a gzera shava by mitzvah, from mitzvah to Eved Ivri, but yet he doesn't learn out a gzera shava from mitzvah to chalitza? To which the Gemara says, you're right. Am Rabbi Yochanan, muchlefes hashita. You have to switch the opinions. Inachinami, it's Rabbi Lazar in the Mishnah who holds that halacha lamaisa again, that chalitza has to be done with the right foot, and the Rabbanan who say that b'di eved it can even be done with the left. To which the Gemara says, and that makes everything symmetrical. To which the Gemara says, Rav Amrli Odom no seifach. No, don't switch it around. I'll tell you why. Ozen mufni, regel lo mufni. Rabbi say, you've seen this before. In order to make a gzera shava, what do you need? In order to make a gzera shava, remember, what's a gzera shava? You find the same word or same phrase in two different places. And what does that allow you to do? It constructs a halachic bridge to connect those two things and enable you to learn out very different halachos and apply them in different cases. To do that, the gzera shava has to be what we call mufna. Mufna means it has to be free. Now remember again, about we've seen over our journeys of Shas what? There's different levels of mufna, right? Remember again, there's mufna mitzad echad, mufna mishnei tzadin. You can be open on one side, open on both sides, and depending on the level of openness, will depend on the strength of the gzera shava. To which the Gemara Rava says there's a big difference. The ozen mufni. I will say that ozen that's open. That's not used for any other drasha. Therefore, halacha l'maisa again, you can learn out ozen from Eved Ivri to mitzorah. Regal lo mufni. But regal is not open. We'll say it's not open. Lo mufni. Rashi says over here, lo mufni. Mishnei tzadin ela mitzad echad. See, Rabbi say regal. It's not open on both sides. It's only open on one side. Why? The Gemara says the mitzorah miyusar aval bechalitza lo the leka elachad. Rabbi say, remember again, the regal by chalitza, the Gemara Rava posits, is used for other drashas, so it's not open. While it's true that the regal by mitzorah is open, the regal by chalitza is not. It's not. And therefore, again, v'kasar Rabbi Lazar mufna mitzad echad lemeidim im ein tshuva v'meish lashem mishiven. And Rabbi Lazar says, if you have a gzera shava that's open on one side, like you have, so Rabbi say, here's what's happening over here. So remember, you have regal. It says regal by chalitza. It says regal by mitzorah. So we'd love to make a gzera shava. What's the gzera shava we'd like to make? What's the gzera shava? Just like the blood application by the mitzorah is made where? On the big toe of what? The right foot. So too chalitza must be done on the right foot. Here's the problem. Regal by chalitza is not open. It's not open. We use regal by chalitza for a whole host of drashas, so it's not open. And here's the problem. Because it's not open, that doesn't mean the gzera shava can't work. But if you have a way to refute the gzera shava, and the gzera shava is only open on one side, that shuts it down. And Rabbi say this is a refutable gezerah shava. How is it refutable? V'chila mufni my pircha. I tell you, ikal mifrach ma lemitzor shekeim taon eitz erez ezov ushni tolas. Rabbi say there's an easy pircha on this one. What's the easy pircha? The process of mitzorah, purification of mitzorah, requires so many additional ingredients. What do you need? You need 8 erez, you need a piece of cedar wood, ezov, hyssop, shni tolas, red wool, right? And also a little thing called paraduma. Well, actually, I'm sorry, this is not my part, this is by mitzorah, excuse me, by mitzorah. So because mitzorah requires so many other pieces for purification, the cases are not really comparable. So therefore, I will say, it turns out that we have 2 major machlokas in the Mishnah, right? Machlokes number 1, can you do chalitza at night? Tanakama is saying yes, Rabbi Lazar is saying no. We already said, how do we paskin? Like Rabbi Lazar, chalitza cannot be done at night. Second machlokes, can you do chalitza with the left shoe or with the left foot or not? Tanakama says it's possible. Rabbi Lazar says it's kosher. Rabbi said the way we paskin in this case is like Tanakama, namely you cannot do chalitza with the left foot. And if you do so, halacha is ultimately again it is possible. Have to do it again. I'll point out for this halacha also, it makes no difference if you're left-handed or right-handed. Right? In other words, this is an objective halacha over here that is done with the right foot. Incredible. So what says the Mishnah? Interesting case. Chalsa v'rakaka avalo kara. So we'll say we're going to see there are 3 parts of the chalitza process. And again, we're gonna put this all together. We'll look in the Rambam and we'll see how the Rambam actually spells out the chalitza process here. So I will say, what do you have? What are the 3 components? 3 components in the chalitza process are the removal of the shoe, spitting, and the recitation of psukim. So here's what the Mishnah says. Chalza v'rakaka. So we'll say we're going to deal with the Mishnah now where you did 2 out of the 3 parts of the process. So chalza v'rakaka, she removed the shoe, she spit, avalo kara, but she did not go ahead and recite the psukim, the requisite psukim. What's the halacha? Chalitza sekshera. The chalitza is good. Similarly, kara v'rakaka, what happens if she said the psukim, she spit, avalo chalza, but she didn't remove the shoe? Chalitza sapsula. Then the chalitza is possible. What about chalza v'kara avalo rakaka? What happens if she removed the shoe, did the psukim, but didn't spit? So Rabbi Lazar Omer, chalitza sapsula. Rabbi Lazar says the chalitza is not good. Rabbi Akiva Omer chalitza sekshera. The chalitza is good. So Rabbi says, see, here's what we see. What's the part that everyone agrees is an absolute necessity for the chalitza process? Removal of the shoe, right? The other 2 things, right? And it appears really, again, everyone would also agree that the one dispensable part is psukim. The machlokes is about spitting. So Rabbi says, so again, the case over here is right, chalza v'kara avalo rakaka. So Rabbi say, what happens if she removed the shoe, did the psukim, but didn't spit? So again, here, machlokes Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says failure to spit renders the chalitza invalid. Rabbi Akiva says it's kosher. It's kosher. So says the Gemara Amud Beis Amar Le Rabbi Elazar. So Rabbi Elazar says to Rabbi Akiva, Kacha ye'aseh. So Rabbi says the Gemara is quoting the pasuk, ultimately again by chalitza, and the pasuk reads, Kacha ye'aseh leish asher lo yivna es beis achiv. This is what will be done to the man who will not go ahead and build up his brother's home by chalitza. So Rabbi Elazar says, Kol davar shehu maisa ma'akev. And I both say, Rabbi Elazar is of the opinion that what? Ye'aseh teaches me anything which is active, anything which is a maisa, if you don't do it, ultimately renders the chalitza invalid. And therefore, what Rabbi say? What's included in this? Chalitza and spitting. Therefore, Rabbi Elazar says, if you don't spit, which is a maisa, the chalitza is not good. Amru Rabbi Akiva, Misham Raya, Rabbi Akiva says, come on, that's the best you got? Read one more word. It doesn't say kacha ye'asa. What does it say? Kacha ye'asa leish. Any action that involves the man. Kol davar shumaisa be'ish. The only type of maisa that's ma'akev is what type of maisa? The type of maisa that involves the man. Now, both say, what's the mice that involves the man? The removal of the shoe. Does the spitting involve the man? No. Both say she doesn't spit on him, right? She's right. It's not spitting. So spitting is her maisa. So Rabbi Akiva says, if you're going to bring her, so therefore, both Rabbi Akiva says, I agree with you. Any maisa that involves the man is ma'akev. That's why the removal of the shoe is ma'akev. But spitting, which doesn't involve the man, only involves her, will not be ma'akev. So we'll say, so here's what we have. So case number one, where you spit, I should say, remove the shoe, spit, but didn't read the psukim. Everyone agrees, chalitza is good. Kara v'rakaloch, case number two, you read the psukim, you spit, but you didn't remove the shoe. What's the halacha? Everyone agrees, not good. Machlokes case, right? You went ahead and you removed the shoe, you did the psukim, but you didn't spit. Rabbi Elazar says, no good, puzzle. Rabbi Akiva says, it is good. Machlokes based on interpretation of the psukim. Good. Next case. We'll say very interesting case. Hachirish shenechlatz. We'll say, let's say you have a man who is a chirish, deaf and mute, and he does chalitza. So chirish shenechlatz, he went ahead and did chalitza. Or hachareshes shechalza, or a woman who is a chareshes does chalitza. Or as the Gemara says, or v'choletzes lekatan, or a woman did chalitza with a katan, chalitza psula. In all of these cases, ultimately, again, the chalitza is invalid. Right, the chalitza is invalid. Again, we'll see all these cases. Kitana shechalza, what happens, we'll say, if the woman is a kitana and she did chalitza, tachlos mishetagdil. So we'll say chalitza with the kitana is not going to be halachically valid, and therefore you have to do chalitza with her again when she becomes an adult. Now, this is actually interesting. We'll talk about this case as well. V'imlo chalza, but if you did not do another chalitza with her when she became an adult, and all you have is the chalitza when she was a child, then what? Psula. Ultimately, it doesn't work. Chalza b'shnayim o b'shlosha, v'nimtza echamem karav opasal. So we'll say, we just quoted this case before, talking about the bezdin for chalitza. Let's say you went and you did chalitza with two people, not a bezdin, or you did it with three. But what did you discover? That one of the members of your bezdin was what? Either a karov, a relative, or a apostle. So it turns out you don't have a bezdin. What's the halacha? Chalitza psula. The chalitza is no good. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan, Sandler machshirin. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan, Sandler say ultimately again the chalitza is good. All right, we'll see exactly what their logic is. To which the Gemara says, and there was once a story of a man who did chalitza with his sister-in-law in jail, and it was just the two of them. Uba ma'asifnei Rabbi Akiva, and the episode came before Rabbi Akiva v'hechshir. Rabbi Akiva paskin the chalitza was good. Right? I will say obviously that case is going to need a lot of explaining in terms of what exactly occurred over there that Rabbi Akiva said this would be a good chalitza. Good. Rabbi will say let's analyze. Here we go. Amar Rava. Rava says as follows: Hashta da amrit kriya lo ma'akva. Rabbi say one major takeaway from the Mishnah is what? That the reading of the psukim is not ma'akev. Right? That we know. How do we know that? That's the first case in the Mishnah. If you did chalitza and you spit, but you didn't read the psukim, what's the halacha? Everyone agrees the chalitza is kosher. So I will say this yields for us a very important conclusion, namely, kriya is not ma'akev. The reading of the psukim is important, but it is not an indispensable necessity for the effectiveness of the chalitza. So hasha da amrit kriya lo ma'akva lefichach ilaim v'ilem shechaltzu chalitza sinksheira. I will say based on this, if someone is mute and cannot speak, as long as they what? As long as they remove the shoe, the woman removes the shoe and spits. What's the halacha? What should be the halacha? Should be kosher. What about the Mishnah? Tanan cheresh shenechlatz. V'chareshes shechalza, v'choletzes minakata chalitza psula. But I will say, what did the Mishnah say? If a cheresh or a chareshes do chalitza, what did we say in the Mishnah? It doesn't work. So I will say, what does that tell you? That tells you that apparently inability to say the psukim is what? Is ma'akev. So the Gemara says, my timer, lav mishum de lav b'nei kriyaninu. I will say, what's the reason why the chalitza doesn't work? Isn't it because they're unable to read? So I will say it's fascinating that the hamim of the Gemara is that the reason why chalitza by a cheresh and a chareshes doesn't work is because they can't say the psukim. To which the Gemara says, no, that's not the reason. To which the Gemara says, lo, mishum delav b'nei deyaninhu. Now, Rabbi say it has nothing to do with speech. What does it have to do with? Das. Right? Chalitza requires das. A cherish and a chareshes don't have the requisite das. That's why halacha l'maisa, again, the chalitza is not going to be good. Ihachi ilem v'ilemes nami. So Rabbi said it's fascinating. So if that's the case, that it's das, then a mute should also be unable to do chalitza. Rabbi said it's fascinating. From the perspective of the Gemara, the Havamina is maybe inability to speak represents a lack of das. To which the Gemara says, no. Amar Rava ileim ve'elemes b'nei deyaninhu. A person who is mute has das. The Gemara says, "Upumayuhu dekayavlu." It's an expression. It's just that their mouth hurts them. We'll say, meaning what? This is fascinating. We'll say that. Just want to point out that the Havamina of the Gemara is inability to speak represents a lack of das. Represents a lack of das, right? Kamashkan the Gemara says no. Inability to speak represents a particular, a limited handicap, we'll call it, right? Their mouth hurts them. It's a physical condition, but it doesn't represent a lack of das. Now contrast that with what? Inability to speak and inability to hear, which Chazal take as an absolute lack of das, which Rabbi say, we know up until recent times. Right? Again, a person who couldn't speak and couldn't hear did lack das. Baruch Hashem will say, we live in such different times already. Again, the advancements in terms of a person who is a deaf mute to become a full bar das is absolutely incredible. So I will say, but the Havamina is fascinating. So I will say, there's something incredible. So Chazal say, from the perspective of Chazal, the inability to speak, the Havamina is the ability to speak, represents a lack of das. I will say, I would also add on to that sometimes the inability to speak or the ability to withhold one's speech often represents the highest form of das. Right? So I will say sometimes in our world, a lack of das manifests itself in speaking unnecessarily, right? In speaking in ways that are unbefitting, in saying things that aren't really sensical, and saying things that are deconstructive, harsh, and unnecessary. And sometimes the greatest form of das is the ability to withhold one's speech. The greatest form of das is the ability for one not to speak. But I will say, but it is incredible how Chazal understood that the greatest manifestation of one's das is in their dibor, is in their speech. And I will say again, and it sensitizes us to how we use our dibor. That dibor should be used for the expression of das. Dibor should be used in constructive ways that show my deeper side, my meaning. So I will say, you use words ultimately to build up. You use words to compliment. You use words to bolster relationships. Because I will say that's using your speech in a way. See, I will say, imagine if after speaking to someone, the takeaway of their conversation with you is, wow, that person has das. That person has das. Right? That's the goal. That's how you properly use your dibur as a conveyance, as a portrayal of the das you really possess. Incredible. So the Gemara says, so we'll say, therefore, again, what we're at over here, we'll say, is as follows. That Allah said, therefore, the cheresh who lacks das, obviously, again, can't do chalitza. The ilaim, who's just the mute, ultimately possesses das, quote unquote, his mouth hurts him, but we assume that the das is there. So it says the Gemara, Vaha Amri Dvi Rabbi Yanai, Lefi she'eno ba'amar va'amra. Rabbi Yanai says that ultimately, again, the cheresh and the chareshas, ultimately, again, they can't do Yevamos and Chalitza, or they can't do Chalitza. Why? Because they are not subject, or they're not in the parish of Amar and Amra. So I will say, the Gemara is quoting the pasuk, V'dibra elav va'amar va'amar lo chafatzti lekachta. I will say, the psukim by Chalitza indicate that there's a speaking part. And Rabbi Yanai said that ultimately the Ilaim and the Ilemes can't go ahead and do Chalitza. Why? Because they can't fulfill the Amira. Ela ki itmar derava Aseifa. Rather, Rabbi say ultimately again, when Rava says that Kriya is not ma'akev, he was referring to the latter part of the Mishnah. What's the latter part of the Mishnah? Chirish shenechlatz v'charesh shecholtza. So we'll say if they have a chirish that did chalitza, that's the man. Or chareshes, or the woman is a charesh that she did chalitza. V'choletzes minakatan chalitzasa psula. Amar Rava says, Hashta da amrit kriya ma'akva. Rava say, now Rava says, what do you see from here? The fact that a chirish and a chareshes can't do chalitza. So Rava says, it's interesting. Rava says, what's the takeaway? Takeaway is that kriya is an indispensable part of the chalitza process. You have to have kriya. You have to have kriya. Therefore, lefichach ileim ve'ilemes shecholtzu chalitzasam psula. Therefore, we'll say, what do you see from here? That an ileim or an ilemes who did chalitza, their chalitza is pasul. Umasnisin k'Rabbi Zera, and our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Zera. Dam Rabbi Zera, kalaroi lebila, ein bila makezer. Now, both say, here's the problem. Here's the problem. Right? Shabbos say, now this is an alternate version of Rava. So now in this version of Rava, Rava is looking at the Seifa. Rava is looking at the Seifa. And the Seifa of the Mishnah says that a chirish or a chalesa or a chareshes will do chalitza. What's the status of their chalitza? What's the status? Pasul. Pasul, it doesn't work. Rava says, what do you see from here? What do you see from here? That kriya, the recitation of the psukim, is what? Is ma'akev. Is an indispensable part of the chalitza process. Okay, here, what's the problem with this? Go back to the beginning of the Mishnah. So what was the first case? What was the first part of the Mishnah? What's the first part of the Mishnah? If you do chalitza and you do the spitting, but you forget to do, or you just don't do the kriya, what's the halacha? The chalitza is good. So what's going on over here? So if the kriya is an indispensable part of chalitza, then how do we say that the first case of the Mishnah is a good case? I will say it's very simple. Umasnisin k'Rabbi Zera de Amar, da Rabbi Zera, kalaroi labila ein bila ma'akeves bo. V'chol she'ein roi labila ein bila ma'akeves. Rabbi say, so this is a famous expression that we see used throughout Shas. Rabbi say, literally, bila means mixing. Rabbi say, the halach is when you make a carbon mincha, you're supposed to mix it all together, right? You've got the flour, the frankincense, the oil, you're supposed to mix it all together. So Rabbi say, what happens if you didn't mix it? What happens if you didn't mix it? Because Rabbi Zera is of the opinion is, as long as the mincha is mixable, even if you didn't mix it, it's okay. But if the mincha is not mixable, then halacha l'maisa, failure to mix it is ma'akev, which also becomes an expression to mean as follows. As long as within the process, all of the different pieces are capable of being performed, even if one of them, in this case the kriya, is not performed, the chalitza is still good. Masha'en kain, if let's say the kriya can't be performed, then what? Then it's ma'akiv. So we'll say it's an interesting approach. Rabbi Zera's approach is, as long as technically speaking, all of the pieces of the process can be performed, then the failure to mix the mincha is not ma'akiv. Similarly, again, as long as you're capable of doing kriya, failure to do kriya bidi aved does not ruin the chalitza. But I will say, by the way, in a mincha case, what's the case of a mincha where you can't mix the mincha? What's the case? The case is where, let's say, you overflowed the bowl. There's too much flour, too much oil. So if you were to mix it, what would happen? Everything would spill over. In that case, failure to mix will be ma'akev. So to Rabbi Zera would say that halacha l'maisa, normally kriya is not ma'akev. Kriya is not ma'akev as long as what? As long as what? As long as it can be done. Technically could be done. But halacha l'maisa, again, if it can't be done, then it will be ma'akev. So I will say, so this is this alternate version of Rava. Therefore, Rava will say, therefore, halacha l'maisa, in the case of an elaim, so in a regular person, so the first case of the Mishnah is talking about, quote unquote, typical people. So typical people who could speak. If the woman took off the shoe, she did the spitting, but what? They never did the reading of the psukim. B'diavad, the chalitza is kosher. But halacha l'maisa, again, in the case of an ilim and an ilemes, where they are unable to read the psukim, in that case, failure to read the psukim will be ma'akev. So it's a machlokes. So it's a machlokes ultimately, again, in Rava. Ultimately, again, do we say that kriya is ma'akev or not? So they said before the father of Shmuel the following: Yevamos if Yevamos spit, so we'll say, so now this is, we're switching gears here for just a moment. We're not finished with this previous sugya, we'll say. So the shaila, the fundamental shaila, ultimately, again, we have two questions, right? Question number one is, it appears from the Mishnah that kriya is not ma'akev. Kriya is not ma'akev. The machlokes is how to understand that halacha. Is that kriya is not ma'akev only when it's possible to do kriya? If it's possible to do it, but you didn't do it, it's not ma'akev. And therefore, again, an ilam and an ilemes would not be able to do chalitza. Or that no, in general, kriya is not ma'akev at all. And therefore what? Even an ilam and an ilemes are able to do chalitza. So we'll say that piece is still hanging out there. That piece is still hanging out there. One thing we know for sure is what? What's the status of a chalitza by a cheresh and a chareshes? Not good. Why not? No das. No das. So that's not even a din in kriya, right? That's a din in das. That's a din in das. Because Rabbi say, once you have das, then what? No part of this is good. The chalitza is not good. The rekika is not good. Because when there's not the das, then there's no validity to any part of this process. Good. We'll say just another piece here. Shachal avod l'shmuel. Yevamos sherakaka. So let's listen to this. Interesting case. Look at Rashi. It's actually right across. Yevamos sherakaka lifnei bezdin. Let's say a white Rachel, the widow, shows up in Bezdin with Shimon, her brother-in-law, and she spits. She just spits. So we'll say she just spits. That's it. They walk into Bezdin together. That's it, right? That was just for the effect, right? So I'll say, so what happens? Like, in other words, there's no like, it's not like, welcome, today we're gathered, right? There's none of that. There's like a cup of coffee, none of that, right? So I'll say, she walks into Bezdin and she spits. She doesn't Bezdin, she spits. No shoe, nothing. She just spits. She just spits. So we'll say, so now again, so now here's what's fascinating. So the Gemara says, what do we do with this? What do we do with this? Right? So the Gemara says, tachlots. Now Rabbi say, essentially, the fact that she walked into Bezdin and she spit, what's the effect of that, Rabbi say? The effect of it is, they've closed the door on Yibum. So now Rabbi say, again, obviously that spitting by itself is not going to affect Chalitza, but Lamais, again, what that has done is, Rashi says, Yevamos shiraka lifnei Bezdin, tachlots, the nifselas me'alei meyibum. Because Rabbi say the act of walking into Bezdin shuts the door on you. Rabbi say this is like what we saw yesterday. Yesterday's daf, Rabbi say, remember again, or 2 days ago, which is what Rabbi say. 2 days. We saw it on Erev Shabbos. Rabbi say, right? What happens if we see, let's say, Rachel, the widow, is in the same house as her brother-in-laws, right? And I will say again, they're getting ready for the levaya. And what happens? Rachel goes ahead and takes off Shimon's shoe. And we see it. I will say, what did the Gemara say? No more yibum. No more yibum. What you begin to see, I will say, is a pattern. When she performs a chalitza activity, even though it's not a chalitza activity in the context of chalitza, that chalitza activity, it doesn't count as chalitza, but what does it do? What does it do? It shuts the door on yibum and now necessitates chalitza. So if they walk into Bezdin together and she spits, the Gemara says now that closes the door on yibum and ultimately again requires a chalitza. Michlal de ifslei le'me'achin. So most of this seem to indicate that she is now puzzle from all the brothers. To which the Gemara says, money. Whose opinion is this? Ilim Rabbi Akiva. If you want to say it's Rabbi Akiva, hashta uma b'makom mitzvah de'ikalamim marmidi de'havei amurim de'chi lesnu lo ma'akvi de'chi isnu ma'akvi am Rabbi Akiva lo ma'akva me'achin ifsala. So we'll say now, listen to this. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion, if you remember saying in the Mishnah, that halacha l'maisa, if she did not spit at all, right, Rabbi Akiva, remember again, I will say this was the third case in the Mishnah, right? The case of Chalsa the Kara. She took off the shoe, read the psukim, but what? Didn't spit. Rabbi Akiva says it's kosher. The chalitza is totally good. And I will say, now watch this. The Gemara says like this. According to Rabbi Akiva, I will say, take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, Eimurim dechi isnu ma'akvi. Actually, let's read the Gemara again. Even Rabbi Akiva, so we'll say, if according to Rabbi Akiva, when dealing b'makom mitzvah, b'shas chalitza, so we'll say, at the actual time of chalitza, where what? Spitting is part of the mitzvah. spitting is part of the mitzvah, right? That I would say that halacha l'maaseh Rabosai, it should be like sacrificial parts that when they're not, there are ma'akev, and when they are, they're right, or when they're not, there are not ma'akev. When they are, there are ma'akev. I will say very quickly outside. Look at Rashi. Aimurim dechi isnu me'akvi, basa me'achid le'perek p'tam nishchat, dechi lesun lo me'akvi, koshenit moshel derbos. This is according to Rabbi Akiva. If you have sacrificial parts that are supposed to be burnt to the mizbeach, if they're present, failure to offer them up on the mizbeach precludes you from eating the meat. But if they're not there, then failure to offer them up what? Doesn't preclude you from going and offering the meat. Therefore, so I will say, essentially, it's a long-winded way of saying, if Rabbi Akiva holds that even when you can spit, not spitting does not undermine the chalitza, which means according to Rabbi Akiva, what? Spitting is not an indispensable part of the chalitza process. Then Rabbi say, how could it be that when the widow walks into Beis Din and out of the context of chalitza spits at her brother-in-law, why would that be meaningful and effective? Rabbi, you hear the argument? According to Rabbi Akiva, in the process of chalitza itself, spitting is not a necessity. Then Kal v'chomer, when she walks into Beis Din and just spits, that's not going to have an effect. Ve'ela the Rebbe Lazar. Rather, you have to say it's Rebbe Lazar. So Rabbi said, according to Rebbe Lazar, v'hashnei devarim hamatirim ninu. And I will say, remember, according to Rebbe Lazar, normally there are two parts. There are two parts of the chalitza process which are indispensable, right? According to Rebbe Lazar, what are the two parts? Remember again, according to Rebbe Lazar, what must you have for chalitza? Removal of the shoe and spitting. Remember, chalitza has three parts: psukim, spitting, shoe. Everyone will agree that reading, right, psukim is not the necessity. Rebbe Lazar holds that spitting is one of the necessities. Rebbe Lazar will say that when it comes ultimately again to the spitting and the shoe, they're both indispensable necessities. But Rebbe say if that's the case, really they both only work together. And if they both only work together, then halacha l'maisa, why should it be problematic to go ahead and have her spit without the removal of the shoe? Elo kirebi. Rather, Rabbi said this must. Rabbi, you understand what's happening over here? We're talking about a very specific case where she is showing up in Beis Din. And halacha l'maisa, before anything gets started, what is she doing? She's spitting. And we're saying that she spit, closes the door on Yibam, which we'll say essentially means it doesn't affect chalitza, but it affects a quasi-chalitza. Who is the opinion who says that just spitting affects quasi-chalitza? It came from Rabbi Akiva. Let's go through this. It came from Rabbi Akiva. Why can't it be Rabbi Akiva? Because Rabbi Akiva himself said that even during chalitza itself, halacha l'maisa, spitting is not a necessity. It can't even be Rabbi Lazar, because according to Rabbi Lazar, spitting is only effective when it also has chalitza, removal of the shoe. So who is it? Maybe it's Rebbe. To which the Gemara says, because what did Rebbe say? Elo kirebi. The sign of kivsiat seres in mekanshenes halechem ela b'shchita. Rebbe say again. This is talking about the shtei halechem. Ultimately, again, that's brought during Shavuos. So the kivsiat seres, when you offer up the sacrificial offerings of Shavuos, right? They're only mekadesh the lechem ela b'shchita, right? With shchita of the karbanos. Ketzad. Rebbe say, here we go. Finish this up. Ketzad shacht on lishma v'zarkan daman lishma. If you shecht the karban lishma, and you sprinkle the blood lishma, then kidesh halechem. Then the loaves are consecrated. Shachat shelo lishma and v'zarkan lishma. If you shecht the karban shelo lishma, and you sprinkle the blood lishma, lo kidesh halechem. Ultimately, you don't sanctify the loaves. Shachtan lishman v'zarkan daman shelo lishman. But if you shechted the karbanos lishman, but you sprinkled the blood shelo lishman, kadosh ve'eno kadosh divrei Rebbe. Rebbe says, so ultimately, again, what happens? The loaves are kadosh, but not fully kadosh. They're sanctified, but you can't consume them. Rebbe say, what's the point over here? The point over here is according to Rebbe. Well, I'm sorry, let me just finish up. Rabbi Shimon Omer the Olam Eno Kadosh Ad Sheishchot Lishman V'Yizrok Daman Shelo Lishman. But Rabbi Shimon says, no. Halacha l'maisa said the loaves are not kadosh until you have both shchita lishma and zrika lishma. Rabbi say, what's the point over here? The point over here is according to Rebbe, you could affect quasi status. That was the point of the entire discussion. You could affect quasi status. That according to Rebbe, if you shecht the kivsiat seres lishman, but you sprinkled the dam shelo lishman, what have you done? you've affected quasi-kedusha of the loaves. So according to Rebbe, there's the possibility of affecting quasi-status. Therefore, it would be Rebbe who would say that what? That halacha l'maisa, when a woman shows up in Beis Din and spits, what's the effect of just spitting? What's the effect of just spitting? You've affected a quasi-chalitza. And what does quasi-chalitza do? What does quasi-chalitza do? Not really anything except that it shuts down the possibility of yibum and triggers a necessity now for a full-blown proper chalitza. So I will say, therefore, it turns out that the case of the woman who shows up in Beis Din and just spits, the halacha is, we're saying now the halacha is, no more shuts a door and yibum, requires a chalitza. It's not Rabbi Akiva because he holds spitting is not necessary. It's not Rabbi Lazar because Rabbi Lazar holds spitting is only meaningful when accompanied by what? Removal of the shoe. So who is it? It's Rebbe. Rebbe who holds that you could affect quasi-status. Okay, Rabbi say we'll stop over here for today. Continue with the Sugim Hashem tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chavra on Zoom. Everyone have a great day. Great to see everyone. Dr. Gladstein, good to see you. Baruch Hashem, Dr. Gevant, Bennett, Michael, Chaim, good to see everyone.